Dr. Rybak will give us a perspective of the quality of life from a medical perspective. So please welcome Dr. Leonard Rybak.
Thank you, Father Fiala, for your kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Did that cold wind wake you up this morning? It's really a great pleasure to speak to you this morning about this topic. It's one that's dear to my heart, although I don't really consider myself to be an expert on this topic. But I'll give you my viewpoint. How are the slides coming? You have what? Oh, the pro, okay. Well, I'll go ahead and start speaking in the meantime. The first slide I was going to show you was a quote from Woody Allen, just to light things up a little bit. Woody Allen said that when he thinks about the end of life, he says, "It's not that I'm afraid of dying, it's just that I don't want to be there when it happens." I think that's the philosophy of a lot of people. They're afraid of dying. We'll talk about what we as physicians can do about that to help our patients, to help them if they're suffering from a physical or psychological disorder. And one of the things we're going to talk about is who is charged with the responsibility of determining the quality of life of the patient. Is it the patient himself? Is it the family, in the case of those who are unable to make a choice, such as infants or adults who become disabled or unconscious? Is it the physician who makes a dictatorial choice? How does his moral compass influence his recommendations to the patient or his family? Is it the insurance company, the HMO, or a third-party payer, such as the government, which may be running our health care in the near future? Are they in charge of this duty? Finally, is society able to dictate what choice the patient can have about his standard of life? Is the patient's life worthy of living? Does he or she have a duty to die? Finally, I'll give some suggestions to help patients, families, and us caregivers to have a clearer perspective on the quality of life and to help them see that life is worth living, even under adverse circumstances. Now, quality of life is an arbitrary term. Okay, that's all right. It's pseudoscientific. It sounds very scientific, quality of life. It sounds like something you can measure, but actually it's quite relative and subjective. Frequently it's used as a negative in influencing a patient's decision. It may have utilitarian aspects to it, about the value of life itself. And as we all know, life itself is being devalued in our current society. Pellegrino described quality of life as an infinitely malleable term. No two persons have the same definition of it. Even within a family, they can have conflicts about what a person's quality of life is. Some may define a good quality of life as absence of any suffering, no suffering whatsoever. There are no solid quality of life measures that really identify which patients feel that life is worth living and which ones do not. They may say one thing or another, but the other fact to consider is that they may change their mind over time. And I'll show you some examples of that as we go along. Now, some authors have developed psychological models to define the optimal human being. Who is this person? And to predict subjective well-being. They admit that it's subjective. They have proposed a 6-level model of, quotes, optimal existence, and have tested the hypothesis that these factors would predict subjective well-being in healthy young college students from 2 different cultural settings, one at the University of Missouri and one at Singapore. These 6 levels include psychological need satisfaction. The second one is positive Big 5 trait profile. These 5 traits are extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, that's a mouthful, agreeableness and openness, good personal goal progress, high self-esteem, positive social support, and happiness conducive cultural membership. It all sounds like great things. The best predictors, here we go, right on cue. Continue from there.
Yeah, we'll go to the next one. That's it. Okay.
The best predictors are shown here. High competence and satisfying needs, which includes autonomy, a low level of neuroticism, good progress towards goals, and high level of social support. Social support is very important, because then the patient or his family do not feel abandoned either by the physician, by society, or by other family members. Now, let's talk about who might be determining the patient's quality of life. I mentioned this at the beginning. They're listed in the slide, as I said before. One would think that the patient will be the one to make the decision, since it's his life that we're talking about. Well, as you can see, autonomy ranks very high. This is the ultimate in personal freedom. It gives the patient a sense of self-ownership and choice. That's the catchword these days. The secular viewpoint may encompass how useful the patient feels. Economics and hedonistic values may play an important role. We hear a lot today about cost effectiveness of treatment, futility care, and I'll talk about that in a moment. What about those who are actually facing serious life-threatening illnesses? What does a seriously ill patient say? A sample of patients was asked what they thought was important at the end of life. Freedom from pain was at the top. We all want to be free from pain. Nobody loves pain unless you're masochistic. The next was a desire to be prepared for death. They didn't want to be caught unawares. Then achieving a sense of completion, goal of progress, as I mentioned earlier. The desire to be mentally aware. Decisions about treatment. Being treated as a whole person. Having funeral arrangements made ahead of time so that the loved ones are not stuck with making those plans on the spur of the moment. Not being a burden. Most of us don't want to be a burden. Yet being a burden can actually be a blessing to our families, I'll talk about later. Altruistic feelings of wanting to help others and to come to peace with God. A group of 286 patients in palliative care at the University of Rochester were asked, what bothers you most? These are all patients who are terminal or pre-terminal. There were 7 categories of responses. Physical distress was at the top, worry about pain. Psycho-spiritual stress, relationships with family members, friends, unresolved conflicts, worry about the dying process. Loss of function and autonomy. Loss of function and autonomy. We all want to be in charge in American society. Distress about where they were or with the treatment that was given by the provider. Let's talk about the patient as the one who decides the value of their life. Peter Admiral, a Dutch physician who advocates euthanasia, has stated, it's the patient who decides. The patient knows the exact moment. It's his life, and he wants to terminate it at that moment. He's in charge. Others agree, saying that the role of the physician is simply to execute the orders of the patient. We're not to use our professional judgment, we're just supposed to do whatever the patient says and forget about our own conscience. However, others have cautioned that autonomy can be limited by illnesses. In this slide, we show that a person's judgment can be impacted by anger, fear, guilt, anxiety, or hostility. These can all distort the judgment of the patient and make it go one way or the other as far as ending his life. In the Netherlands, if a person asks for euthanasia, these are the requirements of the law. They focus on suffering and hopelessness. Hopelessness is another subjective term. And this is the most troublesome concern among Dutch physicians. How do they determine if the patient has terminal suffering and hopelessness that cannot be related? And whether the choice is truly voluntary ranks second. Is the patient really making a free decision to be killed? because of the factors that I mentioned about things that impact on autonomy. Depression can also negatively affect autonomy. In the Oregon euthanasia law, 16% of the patients requesting death were clinically depressed. Now, why weren't they adequately treated for depression? And that raises a lot of concern about how well this law protects the patients. The next two slides show how extreme vanity can influence a patient's decision for assisted suicide or euthanasia. This Dutch woman actually requested that she be killed rather than undergo treatments that would make her temporarily bald. She was so vain she was worried she would not be loved by her family if she was bald. She didn't have terminal suffering. She didn't have physical suffering anyway. In fact, she was so energetic she flew through the household chores prior to being killed. She did 6 loads of laundry. She vacuumed the house. Then she lay down at the physician injector with a dose of anesthetic. Now, the late John Paul the Great issued a warning about devaluing human life, as we see in these next 3 slides. And the prevailing tendency is to value life only to the extent that it brings pleasure and well-being, hedonism. Suffering seems like an unbearable burden. Nobody wants to suffer these days. Death becomes a rightful liberation of life. Life is no longer held to be meaningful because it's filled with pain. And when the patient denies or neglects his relationship with God, then he thinks he's in charge of his own life. The hedonistic search for freedom at all costs influences their decision. Now, what about the family making the decision? Of course, if the person's unconscious, or if it's an infant, then someone needs to decide for them what the treatment should be, and whether the patient would have wanted that treatment or not, in the case of extreme treatment. But the family may decide to impose on the patient what they want, rather than what the patient wants. Carter Sneed has pointed out that in the Terry Schiavo case, her autonomy was radically violated. They never did really find out what she wanted. They assumed that she would not want to live like that. What about when the doctor decides? Well, the doctor may fear lawsuits. Sorry, we have a few lawyers in the audience. But the doctor may decide to project the negative aspect of the patient's condition and predict gloomy and sadistic details onto the patients. Among a group of 247 ophthalmology patients in England, when the doctor emphasized the potentially negative consequences of retinal surgery, quality of life was diminished in the patients significantly compared to the baseline. When they emphasized the positive, the quality of life was improved. If the quality of life projected on the patient by the physician is so negative, this may break the patient's will to live and may provoke a request for assisted suicide. Now, this shows some background in euthanasia in Germany starting in the 1800s. German physicians in the late 18th century started performing euthanasia because of the decline of religious influence and significant experience with dying patients made them altruistically want to help the patients, but their motives were distorted. And they had a secularized ideal of humanitarian, compassionate physician treatment. Dangers of euthanasia were warned about by other German physicians who said it's not up to the doctor whether life is happy or unhappy, worthwhile or not, and he should incorporate these perspectives into his trade. And should he incorporate those into his trade, the doctor would become the most dangerous person in the world. And we have some dangerous doctors these days. One of whom is the doctor who believes in medical futility. This allows the doctors or bioethical committees to say, treatment is futile, we can't help this patient, let's allow them to die or let's help them to die. And this is happening in Texas for sure. It is going to spread to other states without a doubt. In Nazi Germany, the physician served as a selector. He picked out who would live or die. Patients were classified as inferior, burdensome, or not worthy of life based on their occupation when they did it in relation to society. Christian Barnard, who everybody reveres as the first heart transplant surgeon, has gone over to the dark side. He's advocating euthanasia. He said that the quality of life is a medical decision. The doctor has to decide. When the time comes, you don't have to ask the patient. You don't have to consult the relatives. You don't have to do anything except put the patient quietly to sleep. He sees it as the duty of the physician. Another euthanasia advocate is Peter Admiral in the Netherlands. He says, also pessimistically, if there's no medical solution for the problem, I tell the patient, I can't go on any longer with it. It just gives up. Then I offer him euthanasia. What kind of doctor is that? How about when society or the government decides? Well, in Nazi Germany, medical ethics were both sexist and racialist. The Nazis emphasized cleanliness, punctuality, you have to kill the patient on time, do it in a clean way, orderliness, do it in an orderly way, and be totally blindly obedient to Hitler. Productive workers were superior, as I mentioned before, and handicapped persons had little use and warranted being killed. The Oregon Health Plan seems to echo these sentiments. History repeats itself. Rather than pay for chemotherapy for advanced cancers, it offers the patient assisted suicide. There have been letters sent to at least 2 patients saying that we won't cover your chemotherapy because the chance of survival is less than 5% for 5 years. Instead, we'll pay for assisted suicide. What kind of plan is that? How about infants with disabilities? The so-called Runningen protocol legalized the killing of severely ill newborns in Holland. And the requirements are that the child have irreversible suffering, and the physician violates the autonomy of the child by making a decision for him, or the family does, depending on who makes the decision. So, running a protocol, the child has to have hopeless and unbearable suffering. How do you decide if it's hopeless and unbearable for the child? Can you ask them that question? The physician judges the severity of suffering to be so severe that the child would rather be dead than alive. And the child would be too much of a burden for the family and for society. So this is horrible. Even married adults cannot predict decisions about end of life by their spouse. Killing a child is the greatest harm that a physician can cause for a pediatric patient. Children are being killed in the Netherlands under this protocol, even if they have just spina bifida or hydrocephalus. But these conditions don't cause intolerable suffering. They can be helped a great deal by surgery. We've even had advances in fetal surgery for spina bifida, where the spina bifida has been repaired in utero. The child placed back in the uterus, carried to full term, with much better results than if you wait until the child is born. Neonatal surgery can alleviate many congenital conditions. Including diaphragmatic hernia and other conditions that used to be uniformly fatal. Now, there are positive ways that we can help children with terminal illness and severe disabilities such as trisomies. Many of these have a very poor prognosis. But there's a man who participates in triathlons to raise awareness of the dignity of these children. They don't deserve to be killed, they deserve to be taken care of. And alternatives to euthanasia and care certainly exist. Pediatric palliative care emphasizes an interdisciplinary team approach for the physical, social, and psychological needs of the patient and the family. Expert pain management and associated symptoms can definitely be achieved. This holistic approach to pain control, symptom management, and psychological support should be the standard of care for children with life-threatening illness. Resources should be provided for its implementation. The sole criterion for ending the life of these infants is poor quality of life. Who gave the physician the right to determine the quality of life and kill on this basis? Infants need to be protected by society, irrespective of their medical condition, and not condemned to die. Let's talk about another interesting condition, which is very much in the news, the persistent vegetative state. This is a very dehumanizing term, which was used to characterize Terry Schiavo. Plum and Posner, prominent neurologists who study patients in coma and altered states of consciousness, have admitted that the limits of consciousness are hard to define satisfactorily, and we can only infer self-awareness of others by their appearance and their acts. We really don't really have the tools just by looking at the patient and examining them to find out what their true self-awareness is. Now, the diagnosis is based on the concept of wakefulness without awareness. The patient is awake, like Terry Schiavo was, but they claim the patient has no awareness. The eyes are open, but the patient is in a vegetative state, just like a vegetable. So why should we keep them alive? And they are assumed to be completely unaware, even though they show that there are clear signs of wakefulness. However, the assessment of these patients is very difficult, and it's very subjective. Try to stimulate the patient and see if you get a voluntary response. Patients in this state sometimes have spontaneous movements, which are then said to be involuntary. Positive diagnosis of this condition relies on a negative finding, no signs of awareness, and subjected to type 2 or false negative result error. There is no yet universally agreed upon definition of consciousness, and to even greater extent, self-consciousness or sense of self-being. The only reliable method for determining whether another person is conscious is, as I mentioned, by eliciting a response to a stimulus. It may be spoken words, nonverbal signal on the part of the patient, but usually they can't speak. Maybe they can blink their eye. But this only allows the examiner to infer awareness. Our ability to know unequivocally that another person is consciously aware is ultimately determined not by whether they are aware, but by their ability to communicate that awareness through a recognized behavioral response. So it depends on the skill of the examiner to elicit that response. First, the inability to move and speak is a frequent result of chronic brain injury. It doesn't necessarily imply that the patient is not aware. Secondly, the behavioral assessment is highly subjective. Behaviors such as smiling and crying in the absence of stimulation are typically reflexive and automatic, as I mentioned. In certain contexts, they might be the only means of communication available to the patient, and therefore they actually are volitional acts. These difficulties, coupled with inadequate experience and knowledge on the part of the examiner, because of the relative rarity of these complex conditions, contribute to alarmingly high rate of misdiagnosis. This is a very frequently misdiagnosed condition. In England, a study was done that would give labeled as vegetarian and were not given proper diagnosis and treatment. Now, some of these patients will respond to auditory stimuli, and this can predict a recovery from this state. Auditory stimulus can elicit a response either measured physiologically by measuring brain waves, called mismatch negativity, or you can do functional neuroimaging studies which show that PET scans will light up after auditory stimulus, or MRI, functional MRI studies will show that the auditory part of the brain will light up after stimulus with sound. This shows that they do have cognitive abilities that we haven't been able to detect before. These findings have profound implications for how we care for these patients, how we diagnose and treat them, what their prognosis is, and for medical legal decision making. With proper treatment, many of these patients can make improvements. So it's very exciting that Dr. Owen in England has done a number of studies recently that shows that functional MRIs can be used to detect responses in patients to auditory stimuli and to verbal stimuli. It was recently used to demonstrate that a young woman who fulfilled all the internationally accepted criteria for the vegetative state was in fact consciously aware and was able to make responses using her brain activity. This shows how they do the sections of the brain using functional MRI. They don't actually cut through your brain. With the computer, you're able to do this. And you can see some areas lighting up in the brain here to show activation after the stimulus. These are actually MRIs from one of Dr. Owen's articles showing how this woman responded to tasks that she was instructed to perform. You see on the top there's a hole in the skull. That means this patient had a head injury, and she was diagnosed with persistent vegetative state. Now, in the upper left corner, the patient was told to imagine that she was playing tennis. And that part of her brain lit up as the motor part of the cortex. In the lower left is a representative functional MRI of a normal person responding to the same task. Imagine you're playing tennis. The same areas light up. In the upper right, the patient was told, imagine that you're going through your front door of your house and walking through the rooms. And these various areas lit up. The same task was proposed to the control patient, the control person, normal person in the right lower corner. And this showed the same areas lighting up. So these are very exciting. Is this a one-time thing that just was shown in one patient? No, it's been shown in several patients now. Residual language function in patients diagnosed with either persistent vegetative state or minimally conscious state has been shown in 3 of 7 patients who had the diagnosis of PVS and 2 of 5 patients who had the minimally conscious state diagnosis. It showed normal response to both sounds and speech compared to the responses to non-speech sound in normals and in the patients. Importantly, although these two groups differed behaviorally clearly, the findings were indistinguishable between a normal person and a person in these minimally conscious states, including PVS. These findings should certainly make us rethink how we treat these persons. They are not brain dead. Their quality of life is not necessarily zero. They are worthy of our care, and they are worth treating with rehabilitation in order to bring about improvement. If you just let them sit in the room like Terry Schiavo, if she never had any rehab, then she wouldn't make much progress. But if she'd had proper rehabilitation, who knows? She might have made a marked improvement. But after sitting around for almost 2 decades, she made no progress. Now let's talk briefly, going backwards here. Let's talk briefly about mental illness. And I'm not going to say a lot about it, but in Europe is certainly advanced. In the Netherlands and Switzerland, persons with mental illness can be legally assisted with suicide. Mental illness may make life unbearable. In fact, it may cause severe psychological pain. But don't we have methods to treat these patients? It seems to me that the physician is abandoning the patient because it requires too much effort to treat him. It's much easier to simply kill him and get him out of the way. So why can't we help these people? Why don't we just give up? The Supreme Court of those countries said that the pain from mental illness is equivalent to physical pain in patients with physical illnesses. And that may be true, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to help them. It's not necessarily hopeless. People can be helped. And if the circumstances where life is no longer tolerable, they shouldn't be killed, they should be given care. Now let's talk about a topic that may be near and dear to the hearts of all of us as we get older. Aging is a biological process that many of us will face if we don't die of an accident or some other illness. But it may arouse fear. There's a little worry about us getting older. We can't all be like Jack LaLanne. This fear is manifested by a woman who scolded these 2 euthanasia advocates. Our friends Peter Admiral and Christian Leonard. She said, aging patients face physical changes perceived as loss of life. Their functions are diminished. Life may be perceived as nothing. She said, this French woman at a meeting on the International Euthanasia Society said to Christian Barnard and Peter Admiral, don't you see, you're only talking about sick people. Nobody said anything about healthy old people. Now she's talking about healthy old people, not people with illness associated with aging, just physical deterioration with age. They haven't got cancer. They're not even seriously ill. But they've got false teeth. Oh no. They've lost their hair. Ooh. Their hearing's going. They can't see the headlines on TV. Maybe you don't want to see the headlines. It's progressive, slow decay. Yes, that's the condition of the human person. They can't go in their garden. Imagine that. Life is nothing. Don't you realize that when a person thinks that he or she has lived long enough, the doctor should help them end their life before it's too late? I don't know when it's too late, I guess. Whatever that is. This was in Rita Marker's book quite a while ago, and I think a lot of people are thinking that way. They don't want to face the debilitation of aging. These patients are depressed, they're in despair, they're hopeless, they're tired of life. They lack resilience. So research from the University of Zurich in Switzerland, where euthanasia is rampant. Many of these patients have chronic and other non-life-threatening illnesses when they were terminated. And so you don't have to be terminal to be killed there. Being tired of life and in very poor health are becoming more frequent reasons for committing assisted suicide. And these are two euthanasia advocate groups, Exit and Integritas in Switzerland. Now these people lack resilience. Resilience is a great trait that would help them to see the value of their life with aging. And I think part of the problem, among other things, is the loss of the extended family, where you had grandparents and even great-grandparents living in close proximity or even in the same house with family members. And now everybody's scattered, his families are smaller. Grandma and grandpa's warehoused in the nursing home, forgotten about, or sent to Florida and never visited. This trait of resilience helps us to deal with aging gracefully. It gives meaning to life. And spirituality is one aspect that can really help our resilience. It helps to moderate the negative effects of stress and promotes adaptation. Life is a series of adaptation responses to stress. And if we don't adapt, then we can become hopeless. It's positively associated with successful aging, regardless of the income. So we don't have to have a big income in order to be resilient and to face aging courageously. And there's a drive to give meaning to life. That's very important. Patients need to have meaning, regardless of whether they're elderly, young, or in between. Take time to live. Especially important is to value friends and family. Keep mentally and physically active. Keep working in the garden, even if you can't do a great job. Positive attitude, embrace life with youth and enthusiasm in spite of their decline in function. So don't let that slow you down. I mean, it slows you down, but you don't have to stop your cold. You don't have to be killed because of that. As I mentioned, spirituality is very important. A series of elderly heart failure patients had a high incidence of depression. I would be depressed too if I couldn't do much because of chest pain or inability to breathe or limitation of going up and down the stairs. And they lack resilience with social and spiritual support. We're lacking. So that's where we need to make our changes. What can be done? Well, I've got some points to raise about what we can do to improve the life of our patients and to improve how we deal with them. Give the patient respect and dignity. Recognize his fears. Tell him that it's okay to be afraid of dying, that everybody fears that, even you, the physician, fear dying. But it doesn't mean that you're lacking in hope. Consider his life story. View him as a person. Give quality care. Don't give up on the patient, as the euthanasia advocates say. Let him know that pain can be controlled. Recent studies have shown that nearly every patient can expect pain control, in spite of what the media tells you. And don't give up on medical research. Why do we do medical research? We're trying to help patients. And if we give up on the patient, we might as well not even bother to do medical research. You have to consider the patient's life, loves, failures, families, and dreams. Talk to them about it. Spend some time. Evaluate the quality of the person's life by knowing the patient as a person, not as a number. Kidney patients with severe kidney illnesses have pointed out these factors. there's a close relationship between quality of life and quality of care. So if we project a negative quality of care, how's the patient going to react? A negative quality of life. My quality of life must be terrible. My doctor is frowning, he's saying everything bad's going to happen to me. My prognosis is 0. I might as well be killed. The physician must continue to care for the patient even when therapy is not going to be successful. So if it looks like whatever treatment you might consider, chemotherapy, radiation, whatever it might be, is not going to cure the patient, you must not stop caring for the patient. That must continue. As I mentioned, pain can be controlled. This is an old study from British Hospice that showed 80% of patients could be controlled with pain that was only mild. And they had moderate pain when they moved around and exercised. However, this has been improved upon in a more recent study. The palliative care unit in London, they got 96% pain control. That's pretty good. That's approaching 100%. And sometimes it requires changing the type of pain medicine that you're giving the patient. Switch from one opioid to another, switch from morphine to oxycodone. You have to be creative. You don't just stick with one protocol and say, okay, we failed, time to kill you. On the case of head and neck cancer patients, which is the type of patient I deal with, investigators at our institution at Southern Illinois University are doing studies with exercise. Exercise seems to be beneficial for a variety of different illnesses, including aging, if you want to call it an illness. Cancer patients may be much better. The head and neck cancer patients typically will withdraw and be inactive and sit in their home, watch TV, or maybe just sit in the dark room and not do anything. Well, if you get them stimulated, get them active, moving around, doing exercise, it improves their outlook on life. Quality of life is markedly improved, their fatigue is reduced, and their quality of life is dramatically improved. Our research is designed to find new ways of helping patients with their quality of life. Now, when you hear about Lou Gehrig's disease or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, oh, it's terrible, the patient's wasting away, they can't eat, they're choking, they can't breathe, they're going to die, it's depressing, there's nothing we can do for them. No, not true. We can help them with therapy to improve their quality of life. And there's a lot that can be done with the multidisciplinary approach. I don't have time to go into details today, but there's recent publications that show that to be true. And we can certainly give them a positive outlook. A friend of mine who's a physician in Springfield, his wife had ALS, and he took care of her. He had nurses around the clock taking care of her. She had a feeding tube in, and she had a peaceful, happy death. She had a very strong relationship with God, and her death was a blessing, not a curse. So I'm sure she's done her purgatory on earth. So comprehensive clinical care of patients can help a variety of different illnesses, and especially ALS. Increase life expectancy, greatly enhance their quality of life by showing that you care for them. The power of touch is something that's undervalued in our society. A poorly informed physician may say, there's nothing we can do for ALS. It's time to terminate you before it gets worse. Not true, we can help them a lot. If nothing else, show that we love them. What about multiple sclerosis? That's another disease that has a very bad connotation. Oh, these patients are in a wheelchair, they can't do anything, they have poor bladder and bowel control, they have outbursts of excitability, depression. What can we do for the poor patient with multiple sclerosis? Well, multiple sclerosis is something that's been treated with adult stem cells, and I don't have time to go into details today, but also with therapy again. Not only physical therapy, but also helping the patient with cognitive function, emotional functioning, and sleep is very important for all of us, and we don't get enough of it, that's for sure. But the multiple sclerosis patients seem to be helped particularly by sleep. What about spinal cord injuries? Everybody cringes when you hear about that. The level of physical activity that you can achieve in the patient, they predict improvement to the point where they can walk with some assistance. And this is another area where stem cells are being used in Portugal. Intervention is aimed at improving the physical activity. So a paralyzed woman in England who broke her neck in a trampoline injury had surgery to replace the fractures in her neck. And then she was placed on this device called the Locomat. Sounds like a funny name, sounds like a laundromat, but anyway, it helps for the patient to make certain movements, to strengthen their muscles, and to improve their functioning in spinal cord injury. And she made a dramatic improvement. Dr. Jamil, who directs the center, said the Locomat enables spinal injury patients to move their legs in a pattern that is consistent with normal walking motions and can literally help them to train their brain to teach the body to move again. And to Dr. Jamil's astonishment, 4 weeks after using this robotic treadmill, 5 months after the accident, Ms. Sykes was able to walk short distances using crutches, so that's a tremendous improvement. In case of heart patients with chronic heart disease, failure, aerobic training again is helpful. There have been some other studies that say it may not help, but it looks promising. It's something that we need to look into. End-of-life quality care must be improved. Elderly and chronically ill patients cannot simply be stuck in a warehouse and forgotten about. Abandoned by their family, abandoned by the physician, abandoned by friends. They need to be cared for. Physician and patient goals should be discussed ahead of time, and in a positive light, not in a negative light. In our zeal to disprove and reverse all classical tenets of medicine, the secular bioethicists have really caused a lot of problems. They've tried to reject ethics that have been found helpful for the last 2,500 years. If possible, we should try to recruit family members to help take care of their patients. Now, it may not be feasible for them to do it full-time, but they can get caregivers to help them out. It would help to reduce the isolation of the patients, which is a big problem. Talk to patients about their fears, expectations, hopes, options for what we can do to help them at the end of life. Discuss their family concerns and burdens, see if we can help them out with social work or whatever needs to be done. Acknowledge their suffering and say that we treat them. Give them a sense of meaning and quality in their life. Help find out if they're depressed and treat their depression if they need treatment for that. Spread the truth about pain control. Tell people that the media is false about poor pain control of patients. Most patients can be controlled with pain if the physician is creative and uses the proper treatment. Deconstruct the semantic industry of the secular bioethics. We need to educate physicians and the public about pain control. Our hospitals have pain control committees in many cases. We have one in St. John's in Springfield, and they actually monitor the patients to make sure that we're giving them adequate pain control. There's a lot of fear by doctors that they're going to make the patient addict or that the government's going to prosecute them for using narcotics. But if they're properly used and not withheld, that's proper medical care. And affirm your commitment to the dignity and inviolability of all human life. The American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Care Medicine has come out with a horrible statement, study neutrality. And this is not in that specialty alone. Other specialty boards have come out with study neutrality, whatever that means. It means they can't take a stand on anything. Like Pontius Pilate, they're going to wash their hands of the whole thing and say, we can't decide whether we should be for or against physician-assisted suicide. Well, we need to urge them to change their position. Affirm life. Don't give up on people. What kind of tide of care is that at the time? Well, we don't know what to do. We don't know if we should kill you. There's a psychological term called the hedonic treadmill. Our well-being set points change under different conditions. We don't always have the same opinion about end of life, about whether we would want to endure certain types of suffering or not. And sometimes while we're suffering, we decide, I'm going to accept this, Lord. I'm not going to reject it. I'm not going to ask to be killed. This offers hope for increasing happiness and quality of life by counseling patients and contradicts the theory that individual and societal efforts to increase happiness in these patients is doomed to failure. There are many dramatic examples of patients who initially felt hopeless, wanted to be killed, but they changed their mind after counseling. Here's an Indian patient who 2 years prior to this asked for death, even petitioned the President of India for euthanasia. Please kill me. She was having severe arthritis, and she wanted to die. She was depressed, in despair that she'd never be able to walk again. But nevertheless, after she had knee replacement surgery, this patient was able to take life by the horns. The turnaround has been both spectacular and miraculous for this 37-year-old Indian woman who lost all movement for 15 years after a crippling attack of rheumatoid arthritis. She was so disillusioned that she wanted to die. But after the treatment and recovery, she said she regrets the letter that she sent to the president. She's doing better with the walker, and even she doesn't find the walker demeaning. She sees continuous improvement, and she has a positive outlook on life. Here's a picture of Ms. Sue. Now, this is a palliative care physician in Canada who has the right attitude. Dr. Renee Leva tries to help his patients with what he calls depression of the soul. This is a serious ailment that can cause people to want to commit suicide. And it occurs in patients who face serious life-threatening illness. Now you get a patient who's a South American young man dying of AIDS. The patient wants to be killed. He wants to die. A simple help his mind. I don't want to die now. Friend. Love is the only way to another being an innermost core of personality. Love leads to compassion. We need to love our patients. We need to help them find love with friends, volunteers, family members. Compassion leads to true empathy and inclusion. I have a couple other patients who at first blush may seem to have had a very poor quality of life, so-called life not worthy of living, labeled in that term. This is what Professor Smith had to say about what we need, what's missing in our treatment. Love leads to compassion, with meaning, and patients will find meaning if we love them. And that's what's missing in our medical care. We need to teach medical students true empathy. This patient was Diane Odell. She was paralyzed by polio at 3 years of age. Somebody that Wesley Smith knew. She had an iron lung for 58 years. Graduated from high school, iron lung. Took college classes, iron lung. She wrote a book about a tiny star, the aging star. Political campaigns, and unfortunately died after a power failure at age 61. So she truly had a life worthy of living. What got her through it all was her faith, her family, and her friends. Her brother-in-law testified to that. There's a picture of her, it's a little grainy. But there she is in iron lung. Smith said that if you follow the philosophy of John Hardwick, who wrote in the Hastings Center report, that this patient would have been too much of a burden. She had a duty to die. No, he's wrong. We don't agree. Other iron lung patients, Mark O'Brien, he achieved a lot of notoriety. He developed polio at age 6 and spent nearly 50 years of his life, similar to the other patient, with the assistance of iron lung. He graduated from UC Berkeley, and they declared 2 Mark O'Brien days in the city of Berkeley. He was the subject of the documentary breathing lessons. And here's Mark in iron lung. Another friend of Wesley Smith's. John Paul II urged us to face suffering with courage. The courage and serenity with which so many of our brothers and sisters suffering from serious abilities lead their lives when they're shown acceptance and love. That's the key. Acceptance and love. There's authentic value of even in difficult circumstances. It makes the life precious for themselves and for others. And taking care of a handicapped person or a seriously ill person can certainly help not only the person but the caregiver.
couples who with anguish and suffering, willingness to have gravely handicapped children.
Such as vice presidential candidate in the last election.
She's also grateful to those families with adoption welcome children abandoned by their parents because of disabilities or illnesses.
There's a great story on the internet just a couple days ago about Archbishop Dolan of Milwaukee, in which a family gave birth, a woman gave birth to a second handicapped child and couldn't take care of him because the older one was required so much care, so this handicapped child was adopted by a couple who wanted to adopt a handicapped child. That's a great story. John Paul II certainly showed us by his example how to face illness and death with courage and hope. His life is a life worth living, even in his later days. Even in the presence of profound disability or illness, our patients can live lives worthy of living. We encourage them and show them love and caring, and encourage their families to do so. Thank you for your attention. Have questions later, Father, at the panel?
Yeah, we're going to give it at the end.
Okay.
Unless there's one question right away that anybody would like to ask.
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the industry of psychobioethics.
She asked who benefits from secular bioethics. The bioethicists and their supporters. It's a multi-million-dollar industry. They make a lot of money on it, and they help secular individuals make decisions that are contrary to our faith and morals. And so they make a lot of money. It seems like moral activities bring in a lot of money. So I guess the love of money is the root of all evil. Yes, another question. Well, that used to be a problem. In fact, there are books written about that, about people being kept alive beyond what they should be, with extensive financial burdens on the family. And of course, you have to decide individually when to stop care and when to continue care. Never stop caring, but when a medical intervention is no longer succeeding and actually causing harm, then you should stop. But there are cases where people are kept on ventilators. Currently, I would say, when they're being considered as transplant donors. So they're medically dead, but they're kept alive on a ventilator so they can have their organs harvested and placed in another person. That may not be so bad, but it gets to be kind of a gray area. Yes, sir.
Any idea how to just deconstruct those facilities?
Yeah, it's a big problem, just like trying to deconstruct the abortion industry. It's going to take a lot of prayer, a lot of fasting, and a lot of effort in order to do that. We need to encourage the education of solid Catholic ethicists who will provide solid Catholic teaching, not only in the Catholic hospitals, but also in our secular hospitals, because good Catholic care is good health care. You'll find that to be universally true. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was lead psychologist in the Kevorkian cases in Michigan.
Oh.
And I agree very much with what you're saying. What we found was, especially among the women, there was a tremendous fear of dependence, of being dependent, a depression, and people who actually went to him were not so different from the people we treat in suicide prevention generally. It wasn't their illness per se, but a sense of demoralization, a sense of fear of being dependent, and a sense of their life utterly without meaning.
And carried to its extreme, why should we have any suicide prevention at all? Just let the patient kill himself. They have this bridge in San Diego that goes across the corner of Coronado Island. That's a very popular place to jump off and commit suicide. Why should we try to tell people not to do that? Well, it's because their life is worth living. They can turn their life around and make a positive contribution to society. And if we don't, then it's our loss. Thank you.
We have a little break time in the schedule, so you can get something else to snack on or go to the washroom, and we'll begin back at 10:15. We may have a little bit of change in the schedule, but it's no big deal. So enjoy your break.